Hello and welcome. My name is Aaron Stein, Director of the Middle East Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, and you are listening to the Middle East Brief, a podcast focused on developments in the Middle East and why they matter for U.S. foreign policy. Be sure to subscribe to the Middle East Brief on iTunes and Spotify, and sign up to receive FPRI's Weekly Insights newsletter, where a link to the show will be delivered every 2 weeks straight to your inbox at www.fpri.org. Hello and welcome again. On the first part of this podcast, we talked to Marc Pierini about sort of the European perspectives about the recent NATO summit and how it relates to Turkey. And for the second part, I'm talking to Rachel Ellehuus, a senior fellow and deputy director of the Europe program at the Center for Strategic International Studies. It's good to have you on, Rachel.
Thanks for having me.
You know, as I talked about with Marc earlier, as I just said in the intro, is like obviously the NATO summit just concluded, and we focused a lot on the first half of this conversation on European perspectives of Turkey and how that impacted the NATO summit. I thought maybe we would shift now to closer to home, to American perspectives on the NATO summit and obviously the Turkey question and all that entails. So during the run-up to the summit, we had a lot of back and forth, Erdogan saying that he would block consensus on the graduated response plan for the defense of the Baltics plus Poland. Now, obviously, Turkey lifted its block on the final day of the summit. You know, what did you make of that going forward? And maybe get into a little bit about how it wasn't just, the Balts plus Poland that was up for discussion, but also the southern flank and the defense of Turkey.
Thanks, Aaron. Well, I think Erdogan knew all along that he wouldn't get specific language from NATO defining the YPG as a terrorist organization. After all, there's no other ally other than Turkey that officially designates it as such, even if they recognize at some level the potential threat it poses. What I think Erdogan saw was an opportunity to make a broader point that NATO isn't responding, in his view, to what Turkey sees as legitimate security concerns along its southern border. So it's a game that a lot of allies play. They know it's the 11th hour and there's an opportunity to push an agenda and make progress by holding other things up. And Turkey's not the only one who does it. We normally just don't hear about these in the press, so it was a little bit unique that it got leaked in Turkey's case. And you're correct that it wasn't just the plan for Baltic States and Poland that was up for approval among allies. It was also the plan for the southern flank, which includes the defense of Turkey. So ultimately, if Erdogan had not given in, he would have been hurting progress on the defense of Turkey as well. I think we have a compromise as well. If you look at the declaration, the London Declaration language, it says that terrorism in all its forms and manifestations remains a persistent threat to all of us. So there's enough wiggle room in there that Turkey can continue to push the discussion about the extent to which the YPG is a terrorist group and a threat to the alliance as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was maybe to you or to other people, either over email or text, it was, the compromise is sort of standard Turkish language in these documents, which is terrorism in all its forms. And I think they do this because if you have terrorism in all its forms, therefore, so you are ascribing terrorism as a threat. The PKK is designated as a terrorist group by the United States, the European Union, and Turkey. And if you recognize that the PYD or YPG is the Syrian branch of the PKK, therefore the YPG is a terrorist threat, even though people or countries, including France, which we talked about earlier with Marc, and the US, use that wiggle room that the YPG is not designated to try and escape this uncomfortable reality of the disagreements about the southern flank. Would you say that's accurate?
Yes, exactly. I think they found a nice compromise there. I'd also point out that right before the line about terrorism in the declaration, there's one about Russia, where Russia is specifically called out in terms of its actions constituting a threat to the Euro-Atlantic security environment. So that was something, again, that France had resisted. And the fact that Turkey agreed to that so easily, I think, could put to rest some concerns about Turkey's close relationship with Russia. So while it's troubling, I think in terms of long-term strategic interests, even Turkey recognizes the threat presented by Russia.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about the significance of that? I mean, both in terms of what Turkey was at least publicly asking for, which is the idea that you you would list the YPG as a threat, I always thought to be almost a non-starter. But there was, as you just mentioned, relatively aggressive language by bureaucratic standards about Russia in the final declaration. And I think that is noteworthy and a positive development within the alliance, considering maybe where we were in 2013 versus where we were in 2019 in terms of how they define the Russia issue.
Yeah, so I think we've seen a real evolution in the way NATO handles the Russia threat as far back as 2015. I mean, there was certainly a period of a desire for a reset, but since Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea, allies have really responded with concrete deterrence and defense measures, with increases in defense spending, and now with the political language to back that up. There was always a question about a kind of delta between military capabilities and political will in the case of Russia. So whereas a lot of countries were willing to put forward new measures to shore up deterrence and defense, they weren't really willing to overtly call Russia a threat in the way they have done here. So I think that's a positive development. I think it's also good for Turkey on the terrorism front. You know, they can certainly take advantage of consultations to further discussion on SDF and Russia's role in not only the Middle East, but in trying to undermine NATO.
I mean, this kind of raises an uncomfortable question that I'm going to pose to you. It's something that the French President Macron said quite openly in his press conference with Donald Trump. And again, I talked about this on the first segment of this. Is there are concerns within, I would say, the transatlantic community about the Erdogan-Putin relationship, and I do think it's noteworthy that the Turks signed off on that language. But even with that language in there, and as you just said, matching these sort of political words in a declaration to investments and military capabilities, is that you do have one of the allies, and I'm talking about Turkey here, that is now a new major purchaser of Russian defense arms. And I'm talking about the purchase of the S400. I know that you've been involved. I mean, you've studied the S400 issue at length. You wrote a good piece about War on the Rocks on the history of Turkey's efforts to try and purchase, or at least the U.S. efforts to try and sell Turkey a Patriot missile system. What do you make of sort of the S400 issue and like maybe the perceptions of the Turkish-Russian relationship independent of the NATO summit? I mean, I guess they're intertwined, but sort of how that impacted thinking about Turkey before the NATO summit.
It's difficult to unravel the motivations behind S400, whether it's personality based, whether it's industrial based, whether it's threat based. I have a hard time sort of isolating what the factors were that led to that ultimate decision. But I do think it reflects a hedging behavior that we see not just from Turkey, but other allies. You see a lot of European countries, including France, calling for a greater European pillar in NATO, or even, the dreaded term of strategic autonomy, which begs the question of from whom, and the answer is, not surprisingly, the United States. So again, I think Turkey feels that the United States didn't respond to what it sees as, again, legitimate security interests with regard to the YPG presence along its borders, and it sees Russia's influence and presence on the ground in Syria, and therefore is hedging because it believes that Russia will come through on helping Turkey deliver on these concerns. So that hedging, I think, is probably pretty natural, given the fact that we did have difficulties delivering Patriot as well as other weapon systems to Turkey, and also the concerns about Syria in particular. But it's very problematic. I mean, what has become, initially political objections or symbolic objections to Turkish cooperation with Russia could really spill over into the military side of NATO. On the one hand, it could affect NATO military superiority. I mean, we saw the Turks flying F-16s against the S-400 to test them. Think about how that undermines NATO's defenses, much less on a system like the F-35, which is really next generation. So I think Turkey should be focusing more on how the purchase of these Russian systems affect its own security and its own ability to integrate into NATO command and control systems and operate alongside allies in a conflict.
Yeah, and I think one of the consequences is, I mean, it was almost framed like a binary choice to the Turks. I mean, you can either buy Russian S-400, I mean, it was framed as a binary choice,
Yep.
or you can have the F-35. And they made their choice pretty clear in that they chose S-400 over F-35, although they're trying to at least keep open the possibility that they can work out a compromise. Even with Donald Trump, who is quite sympathetic. I mean, to the point of like, I guess, being inaccurate on the facts. President Trump, is sympathetic to their purchase of the S-400 because he falsely believes that the Obama administration wouldn't sell them Patriot. That's just not true. But he obviously believes it because he keeps saying it. But he does appear to be at least maybe hemmed in by the bureaucracy, or perhaps, in agreement with the bureaucracy that the S400 and the F-35 cannot be operated in the same space. And so where is this going? I mean, like, so I always say we had a good London summit, and maybe I'm going to come back to that in a second. It wasn't too disruptive, either from the American or Turkish side. But, what happens in 2 years when many of these same issues are still there, and questions about Turkey and the Russians perhaps continue, both with the operation of the S-400 and perhaps future defense cooperation?
So in the near term, I think we need to, puncture the pressure in the balloon a little bit. And I think on the U.S. side, that is unfortunately going to involve some imposition of the Countering America's for Adversary. I'm sorry, I don't know the name of that, Aaron. What's
Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. It's a good one, CATSA.
So I think we're going to need to take some of the pressure off on the U.S. side by enacting, at least in a limited way, some of the CATSA provisions that push back against Turkey's acquisition of the S-400. I think if the administration goes down that route, Turkey could possibly avoid some of the broader sanctions that would be more destructive to the Turkish economy and the future relationship. I mean, I worry, as you said, if you think a couple years down the road, if we have a complete EU and US arms embargo on Turkey, they will have no choice but to go after Russian and non-NATO interoperable systems. So we need to somehow relieve the pressure and show that the president is serious about enacting CATSA and following up on what is a legal requirement. And then we can have a follow-on conversation about how further purchases of Russian equipment or further cooperation with Russia undermines Turkey's own security interests. But it's hard for me to see how we get out of that without sort of taking this unfinished business off the table of enacting CATSA for now.
I wrote it too, and maybe I'll link it in the show notes below. But it's kind of odd to think about, but with the number and quantity and severity of some of the sanctions bills that are going around Congress, both in House and the Senate, like the best outcome or the best way forward, if you ask me, is actually just to get CATSA out of the way. So you actually sanction Turkey to try and save the relationship rather than not sanction Turkey and make the sanctions worse, if that makes sense. It's an odd dynamic to be in. And I think it's an important point I like to make over and over again, is that the S-400 issue just won't go away. It's going to be sort of this huge irritant moving forward, and I'm not sure how that gets resolved.
I'm not sure either, but I think on sanctions, you're absolutely right. We have to think about the impact these sanctions would have, and really throwing the book at Turkey across the board is only going to help one person. It's going to help Erdogan make another narrative by which he sort of blames the West for Turkey's economic woes, and it really does nothing to shield sort of everyday people from some of the difficulties the tension in the relationship has caused.
Yeah, and I mean, I want to pivot a little bit. I mean, because pivot to internal. So in addition to the concerns in the run-up to the summit about Turkey blocking consensus on alliance documents, I think there's always a concern. I believe it was after the May 2017 summit, which I believe was at NATO's new headquarters, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, if you remember, where there was actually like momentary panic, at least on Twitter, that Donald Trump would announce a U.S. withdrawal from NATO or something along those lines. That proved inaccurate, but I don't think it's a secret to say that the president is not the alliance's biggest fans. But I would have to say one of the positive and I say that trepidatiously, one of the positive outcomes of this is that the U.S. side was not disruptive, or at least wasn't too disruptive this time around, and that you had a relatively positive U.S. experience. I mean, would you agree with that characterization, and that perhaps this is a good thing moving forward, or are there things that I'm missing?
In terms of the summit, I would say it's certainly progress that the U.S. president showed up and accepted the win on defense spending, because what is a fact is that defense spending in NATO has increased for the 5th consecutive year. All allies are now increasing defense spending, and the number of countries who are meeting those markers of 2% GDP on defense and 20% of GDP on new procurements has increased. So NATO's spending more, it's spending better, and it's increasing the readiness of its forces. So there's a lot of good news on the military side. I do still worry, however, about the political tensions and political cohesion. This time, it just happened to be the case that it was politically expedient for President Trump to come in and take the win for defense spending. He deserves partial, but not all credit, since the increases started already back in 2015. But, you never know. Fortunately, NATO's organized things as such that there won't be another summit before 2021. So we at least in this term, don't need to worry about another summit and managing that.
I think, final question as we wrap this up here is, I would say that the biggest driver of increases in NATO defense spending, Trump does deserve some credit, but, the Russians decided to annex Crimea and then invade the Donbass, so it made the prospect of the violent changing of state borders on Europe's periphery real again. And I would say Vladimir Putin deserves a lot of credit for the increases in defense spending. And as we mentioned at the outset, or at least the top of the show, is that there was that political language in the document. If you're looking back, because I know you've been working on these issues a lot, from where the alliance was maybe in 2013 to where it is in 2019, and you sort of set I call it the double T factor outside. You sort of ignore Turkey and Trump for a second. How would you rate the alliance moving forward? Do you think that it's in a positive place, in a state of transition, or a state of decline?
I think it's in a very positive place in terms of its core mission of collective defense. One of the few things that allies agree on is the threat posed by Russia. They disagree to some extent on, the severity of the threat, the extent to which it should be prioritized over other tasks, where it's most poignant. Is it more present in sort of Poland and the Baltic states than in and around the Black Sea or around Turkey? But those are nuances. Everybody really agrees that NATO needs to enhance its core collective defense capability. So that's things like forward presence, the readiness of forces, the command structure. So all of that, I think, looks really good. I think another positive is probably its ability and willingness to adapt to new challenges. So we saw a discussion on China and the extent to which its investment in infrastructure and telecommunications could present a security threat to the alliance. So both of those are sort of positives. Where I do worry is, and where Turkey's involved, but certainly not the only one, is this idea of a democratic deficit. If you look back at the Washington Treaty, it talks about certain values, democratic values that underpin the alliance. And certainly we could point to Hungary, we could point to Poland, we could, even point to ourselves to some extent, about, the extent to which allies really are united around these democratic principles, because that could erode the alliance from within. We have talking about blockages, we have Hungary preventing NATO-Ukraine consultations at a senior level. That is a real internal threat to the alliance and its ability to do business.
Yeah, and that democratic deficit is certainly problematic, because the alliance has actually grown, and I'm actually curious what you think about this, and this really is the last question. The alliance has grown from a relatively smaller group of countries, based primarily in Western Europe, with Greece and Turkey being the exceptions, to now being, all the way out to the Baltic states. Is that democratic deficit sort of a indication of that there's just so many new states in NATO that compromise is harder than it used to be, or is it just indicative of our current political moment? It's something I always grapple with because I'm in favor of NATO expansion, but I believe that NATO expansion has also made it more difficult to get consensus, because rather than dealing with like 12 countries, you're dealing with 29. So just curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And NATO, as it does this strategic review that was just agreed in London, is going to have to think about these things. For example, do we in some areas move away from unanimous decision making and have maybe qualified majority voting? Not on things like whether to deploy forces out of area, but maybe on things like the budget and whatnot. Maybe we could have more flexible arrangements whereby regional groupings of allies can use NATO structures and capabilities and force generation mechanisms, but if you get the political chapeau and agreement from NATO, militarily it could be a smaller subset of allies responding. Because I think this fragmentation that you're seeing at the national level, where you have not only a north-south divide, but an east-west divide, and countries really focused on their immediate regions and the concerns presented by those is causing this underlying tension in how NATO responds. It's no longer a single overarching threat, but rather subsets of threats and different groupings of allies, either willing or unwilling to respond. So I think if we're going to survive into the next 70 years or so, there will have to be a different approach that takes into consideration a more diverse group of allies, but also a more diverse set of challenges.
And then that's really, bring it full circle, that's the Turkey issue. I mean, Turkey is bringing in an out-of-area issue, Syria being out of NATO's core area as defined by the treaty, to try and raise political awareness about how it defines terrorism. And that is driving so much of the, let's say, the angst amongst the alliance. I think obviously the bigger problem is that internal angst about the terrorism issue has driven broader geopolitical considerations, manifesting itself in the purchase of the S400. That is my big concern, obviously, because I'm Turkey focused, but it's how narrow geographic issues that have no place in NATO. I don't think the YPG issue it should be brought up in NATO. Has been used as a vehicle to drive the broader, bigger geostrategic thing, which enables Russia to do what it always tries to do, which is to peel off weaker members and split solidarity.
Yeah, it's challenging because the way the world is organized now, it's hard to use the geographic constraints that were established at the founding of NATO to limit its tasks. They had a big conversation about China. Well, that's not because Europe and NATO are involved in Asia Pacific per se. Individual allies are, but not the alliance as a whole. But China is coming to Europe. So likewise, I would argue that a lot of the problems we see in North Africa and the Middle East are coming to Europe, whether they like it or not. So NATO doesn't have to accept Turkey's view about the YPG, but it does have to accept that things that are going on in the Middle East and North Africa are spilling over into the European theater. And therefore, insofar as they affect European security or transatlantic security, they are something that NATO is going to have to grapple with, either alone or in combination with other organizations such as the UN or the European Union or individual partners who aren't members of NATO. And it's a real challenge because NATO evolves slowly rather than rapidly, but these challenges are coming at a more rapid pace.
With that, I want to thank you for coming on, Rachel. This has been great, and I loved your last comment there because that means I get to have more podcasts on NATO, which is not usually my forte, but something I enjoy studying. So thank you a lot for coming on and doing this.
Thanks, Aaron. It was a pleasure.
And thank you, everybody, for listening.